Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon. Welcome to the latest iteration of the Sporting Lunchtime Lectures here at the Record Cafe in Bradford. For those of you who are thinking, what the hell's going on? Once a month we have a talk, roughly sporting related, guess what, that's at the title. And this time I'm delighted to welcome back Tony Collins to the Record Cafe, who is our third speaker. In the days before laptops, projections, films, we've moved on a little bit, haven't we? It was a boys' bed sheet that we had to try and iron. So it was a bit different, it was a bit more seat in the pants, but Tony was great. Yeah, Boys the Shop, yes. It wasn't a boys' bed sheet, it was a bed sheet from Boys the Shop. So we just thought we'd just get that one ironed out, so to speak. Anyway, it's a great pleasure to welcome Tony back. Tony was my PhD supervisor in the year AD 1066 or something.
Earlier than that.
So it's a great pleasure to welcome Tony back. He's come all the way across from Leeds today in the pouring rain to entertain us and to talk about probably an element of rugby league history that many of us won't be too au fait with. And apparently there is a very good Bradford Northern link. It's great to see the Bradford Bulls are back in the Super League. They managed it despite not getting promoted. But anyway, celebrate. There's always a way, isn't there? Anyway, please give a warm welcome to Dr. Tony Collins.
Thanks very much, Dave. Can everybody hear me? It's working. Yeah. Great, thanks very much. Thanks to Dave, thanks to the Record Cafe for hosting me, and thanks to you for turning out on this terrible, terrible day. So, I'm going to talk about a guy, if you're a rugby league fan, you might have heard of. If you're not a rugby league fan, you probably won't, but you're missing out if you haven't. He is a remarkable character for both what he achieved on the pitch, but also for what he achieved off the pitch. And I think also, his life story tells us something about the history of Britain, and particularly the history of the black community in Britain over the last 100 odd years. So I'm going to start by looking, if I can get the computer on, by asking who was Roy Francis. He was born in 1919 in Cardiff. He was brought up in Brynmawr, which is a small town kind of at the top of the valleys in South Wales. And when he was 17, after playing 4 games for Brynmawr Rugby Union Club, he was signed by Wigan in 1936 got a £300 signing on fee, which in those days, when you consider a house was probably, you could probably buy a house for about 120, 150 quid, was quite an amount. It was quite an amount to pay out for a 17-year-old who never played rugby league before and had hardly ever played rugby union at any high level. From Wigan he moved to Barrow. In 1939 he moved to Barrow in January, and that was just 9 months before World War II broke out. When World War II broke out, both rugby and football adopted the principle that contracts are no longer valid and you could play for whoever you wanted. Both the Rugby League, Championship and the Football League were suspended, and they broke down into local regional competitions. And that meant that players moved around, and there's lots of examples in football of Stanley Matthews playing around for all sorts of clubs, Stan Mortensen, all the great players played for different clubs. Exactly the same in Rugby League. And Roy Francis ended up playing for Dewsbury. You can see the Dewsbury team here. The Dewsbury team was organised by this guy in the middle, who you might recognise as Eddie Waring, the famous Rugby League TV commentator. Now, despite his the image that he portrayed in his later declining years, Eddie was an incredibly smart operator. And before he became a journalist, he became the manager of Dewsbury. And he was smart enough to realise that during World War II, if players' contracts were no longer valid, you could go out and recruit players from wherever you wanted. He also realised that at that point, the maximum wage you could earn in rugby league was £1. Because it was wartime, everybody had to make sacrifices. And so, by some amazing powers of persuasion, he managed to persuade players to come and play for Dewsbury, all the way from Wigan, from St Helens, from Bradford, even from Hull. Roy Francis, Jim Sullivan, the great Wigan player, They all came allegedly to have their £1 per match payment. Of course, what was going on was Eddie was paying them a whole lot more behind the scenes under the counter. And so he built a great team which won the Rugby League Championship and the Rugby League Cup in the same year, before they were eventually suspended by the Rugby Football League for violating the regulations. Nevertheless, this is what launched Roy into stardom. He was top try scorer of the season in 1942, and it helped Dewsbury to win the Championship and the Challenge Cup in 42 and 43. Roy became such a star, and this is where the story takes its first bizarre twist, that he was selected to play for the England National Services Rugby Union team. Despite the fact he was a rugby league player and he was Welsh. How did this happen? Well, it happened because the rugby union dropped their ban. In peacetime, rugby league players, whether you're amateur or professional, were banned from playing rugby league, and a ban which lasted until 1995. But when the war broke out, the rugby union felt the force of criticism that this was a bit hypocritical, and lifted the ban on rugby league players in the armed forces playing. And so when the England Services team was selected, and essentially this was the England team because there were no full internationals during wartime, they also selected rugby league players. So the other main rugby league player who played for the England Rugby Union team was Ennis Ward, the great Bradford Northern player, captain of Northern and captain of Great Britain later after the war. And so, show a photo in here. You can see Roy here, still only 21, 22. Ennis Ward is at the back in the middle there. And Roy ended up playing in, I think, 8 of the 17 England Services Rugby Union internationals during the war. Scored 8 tries, so it was a phenomenal try scorer, given the fact he was rugby union, not a lot of tries scored. And he became not quite a household name because that type of thing didn't really exist in rugby at that point, but he became a big name and a big star player. He also became a PT instructor in the army. I'll talk about that a little bit later when we look at his legacy. His army playing career, both league and union, was interrupted in 1944 when he was broke a leg when he was training troops ready for the D-Day landings. And he only got back to full fitness in late 1945, too late to be selected for the 1946 Great Britain Tour of Australia. However, he was selected to play for Great Britain in 1947. Here he is making his debut at Odsal, another Bradford connection, where he scored 2 tries in Great Britain series, win over New Zealand by 27-12, I think. And he was a star of the match. However, by that time, he'd lost his best years of rugby, of sport, to World War II, and he was approaching 29 years old. And he began to think about what the future held for him after he retired. And he started to look at coaching. And in fact, one of the things he did when he was selected for Great Britain in 1947, because of his background as a PT instructor, he actually took some training sessions with the Great Britain team. So he kind of started to move towards the coaching side of things, even when he was a player. In 1949, he signed for Hull, and in 1951, he was appointed the player coach of Hull. And he created, up to that point, and still arguably, the greatest Hull Rugby League team that had existed. In 1956, they won the Rugby League Championship. 1957, they were runners-up. 1958, they won the championship again. 1959, they played at Wembley, runners-up in the Challenge Cup. In 1960, they did it. So 5 consecutive seasons, they appeared in a major final, which at that point was almost unprecedented. It put them in the Hall of Fame for rugby league teams. Roy became noted as the most innovative coach in rugby, and possibly at that time in sport as a whole. He was the first person to introduce video analysis. So he got a cine camera that was used to film matches and training sessions to be able to tell players what they should be doing. Kind of what you just take for granted now, but he was the first person to do it. He introduced specialist training routines, brought in professional coaches, particularly for sprinting, introduced games that would, training routines that introduced player awareness, so players would play football, they'd sometimes play rugby with 2 balls, anything to get players' brains working and develop them as players. However, the problem he had at home was that the board wouldn't invest in players. And so by the time we get to the early 1960s, the great team that he built, which you might imagine is getting older, and as is faced by a lot of sports teams, whether football or rugby, it was really down to the board to reinforce the team, and they didn't do that. And so in October 1963, he made the move to, and I hesitate to say it in an audience in Bradford, he moved to Leeds. And he did the same thing at Leeds as what he did in Hull. He rebuilt Leeds and built one of their greatest ever teams. He also, because of his innovative training methods, he also kind of created a template for the way that Leeds always liked to play rugby, fast, open running rugby. And it was really Roy that reinvented that for them, and he developed a great team, 2 of them you see here, of young players who became great players and who are remembered today by anybody who knows anything about Leeds or as some of the greatest players ever. You can see Alan Smith, great winger, John Atkinson, the other great winger, there's right at the end, and Jack took over from Roy. Jack Newton. Who sadly died like 5 months after this picture was taken. The picture was taken at Wembley in 1968, the day before the famous water splash final, where the game was ruined by rain, even heavier than what we've got today, and ended up being decided on the last-second missed conversion by Don Fox, which handed the trophy to Leeds. And for Roy, who prided himself on building open rugby, open running teams, it was a kind of bittersweet glory. He wanted to use the platform of being on grandstand, of having a national audience, just to show how rugby could be played and how his teams played rugby. And instead, basically, got a lucky dip in a monsoon. And shortly after the win in the cup final in May 1968, he moved to North Sydney to coach in Australia. He was seen with the North Sydney Bears. Roy sat in the middle. And something happened in North Sydney that kind of was different to anything that had happened in his career in England. He was under a lot of pressure to succeed very, very quickly. One of the things, if you notice the dates, it always took him 4 or 5 years to build the team, to get the team playing as he wanted. So it took him 5 years to get Hull to a championship final, 5 years to get Leeds to the Challenge Cup final. In North Sydney, they expected him to win what they call the Premiership, the League Championship, within the season. He also found it very difficult. There was, unbelievably, given the way things have changed around, he felt that the Australian game was much less professional than the British game. Players had bad attitudes. He fell out with some of the leading players who didn't want to train in the way he wanted them to train. He was a tough trainer for people. And he also fell foul of the press. He felt that the press were overcritical and not supportive. And in the end, he left in 1971. Came back to England. Spent a few months coaching at Hull. Didn't work out. Spent a season at Leeds, where he won the Premiership trophy, which doesn't exist anymore. It was kind of an end-season playoff for the top teams, and then was sacked a few days after winning the Premiership. In circumstances he never fully understood, it seems that, unbeknownst to him, the club only employed him as a temporary coach while they wanted to appoint his eventual successor, Sid Hines, the great player, great centre three-quarter, who became coach. And in fact, Sid kept up Roy's traditions of playing up and running rugby. And finally, in 1975, he came here to Odsal. He kept Northern up. They were on the verge of relegation that season. He kept them up, and the following season they became, kind of mid-table. Not worried about relegation, but not really challenging for honours. And after that, he he resigned. He had personal problems, and he really didn't feel that the game was the same one that he'd left. Times had changed, people had moved on, and Roy's glory years are really the time before the 1970s, and the 1970s were a very different time. And so he eventually left Northern at the end of the 76-77 season and kind of went into semi-retirement. And sadly, he died in 1989, unexpectedly, at age just 70. So that's a brief outline of his career. But there's kind of more to his story, because as you will have noticed from the photos, he was a black man playing and coaching at the highest levels of sport in the 1930s, 40s, 50s and 60s. And really that's essential to understanding how Roy became such a successful player, such a successful coach, and understanding what his life can tell us about Britain at that time. So he kind of connects sports history and social history in a way few other players in rugby or football do. So, and we can see that his entire life and career was marked by the issues he faced by racism and racial discrimination in Britain. And you can say that when you even ask when he was born. So he was born in 1919, January 1919, and in May 1919, Cardiff, where he was born, and literally 5 minutes walk from the nursing home he was born in, racist riots broke out and racist mobs attacked black people's homes in Tiger Bay in Cardiff. Tiger Bay was traditionally the Docklands area, and as in most Docklands area at that time, there was a mixed population of people with African descent, people of Arabic descent, people of Chinese descent. In 1919, just after the end of World War I, the racial tensions that had been under the surface for a long time in Cardiff were kind of fueled by the fact that immediately after World War I, huge numbers of seamen and sailors were made redundant. There was the bottom dropped out of world trade, and thousands of seamen were unemployed. That led to tensions between white seamen and non-white seamen, and Tiger Bay was attacked, as was some of the areas in Liverpool, in the docks in London, Glasgow, and also the following year in Hull as well, the docks in Hull. So Roy was born into this. It had a terrible effect on the black community, who started to fear for their lives. It was seared into the memories of the black community. And it was particularly apparent, and you can see how this works, but if we look at the lives of two other black Welsh rugby players. So George Bennett, who also played for Wigan, the first black player to play international rugby league when he played for Wales in 1935. George Bennett was born and bred in Newport. His father worked in the big steelworks in Newport. And his house was a mile away from the houses that were attacked in Newport. Alec Givens, his second, played for Hull, came north to play for Hull. Second black player to play international rugby league in 1936. His father, who was a sailor, was arrested, despite the fact he was a Welsh citizen, was arrested twice and harassed because after the riots there was a kind of clampdown on what would be described as alien seamen, which basically meant black or Arabic or Chinese seamen. So both those players had personal experience. The other thing they realised in the 20s and 30s was the fact that the Welsh Rugby Union would not pick black players for the Welsh National Rugby Union team. And so then if you were a talented player like these two, then there was only a limit to where you could go. You'd never play for the national team. And it wasn't until 1983, 60 years after this, that Wales actually picked its first black player, despite having a historic black community in Tiger Bay and elsewhere by that time. The other thing that happened, which shows how deep these riots ran, is that this guy, Jerry Shea, who was the first player ever in international rugby union to score a try, a conversion, a penalty goal, and a drop goal in international rugby union, was actually arrested and charged, and one of his teammates who was with him found guilty of actually breaking down the door of a black family in Newport and trying to burn the house down. So you could see that racism was expressed and through what was going on in rugby at the time. The other thing that those riots did was to disillusion black people, a lot of Welsh black people, in their prospects for the future in Wales. And so it led some of them to emigrate, some of them to move. It led some of them into radical politics, and particularly at that point, an organisation called the United Negro Association, led by somebody you might have vaguely heard of, Marcus Garvey, who was like one of the fathers of African nationalism. One of the people who joined was Roy Francis's father, Lionel Francis, who, so it's not a great photo, it's from an old newspaper. Lionel Francis was is an incredible story himself. Born in Trinidad, went to Wales around about 1899, 1900, became a miner, worked in the pits for 20 years, became a Methodist preacher, preached down in the pits, and he fathered Roy with a white woman, which is the second time that he had an illegitimate child with a white woman. And Roy was adopted by Lionel Francis' actual wife, who was a black woman whose family had lived in Brynmawr for 40 odd years. And Lionel Francis left Wales in 1920, 18 months after Roy was born, and went to America and joined the United Negro Improvement Association. This is their newspaper. He attended the Great World Convention of Negroes, as it was called in those days, and became one of the leaders of the United Negro Association. And in fact, he became so successful that he replaced Marcus Garvey as the leader of the United Negro Improvement Association in the 1930s. A fact that was unknown to Roy's family. So it's got this unbelievable story that Roy himself is forging a career as a great rugby player and coach, and his father is in the States, becoming a major political figure in the States. So racism was kind of at the heart of Roy's experience of life and of rugby. And you can see this when he went to Wigan in 1936. He was being developed as a player, a little too young to play regular first team rugby until 1939 when he started to get, 1938 when he started to get selected more frequently. And then in October 1938, Wigan appointed a new manager, this man, Harry Sunderland from Australia, who immediately put Roy on the transfer list. And Roy always thought that there was no reason for this other than the colour of his skin. And that's probably true, because when I was researching the book, copies of which are at the end, on the end table there, I discovered that Harry Sunderland went to Germany for his holidays in August 1939. And he sent back a report on his holidays in which he lamented the fact that Germany did not have more great men like, amongst others, Adolf Hitler. Now, this isn't saying Harry Sunderland was a Nazi or anything like that, but it shows where his sympathies lay. So Roy was transferred very quickly to Barrow, where he teamed up with another black rugby player, an England international, Val Cumberbatch. Here's Roy as a PTI, physical training instructor, in 1943. And you can see he's with two great Bradford names, Ernest Ward again in the middle, and Trevor Foster at the end, who Roy remained lifelong friends with. In the army, Roy learned the skills and to some extent the arts of being a PT instructor. He specialised in soldiers who were convalescing, and he would later come to use all that training he had, because he went through a very rigorous training course in his coaching career. He wasn't the only one, because when you look at the great post-war era of football managers, you'll see that a lot of the great managers, Matt Busby, Joe Mercer, Stan Cullis, they all were PT instructors in the army in World War II. And so Roy was part of that tradition. And he took those lessons with him about how to treat players both medically and mentally. Took those lessons into coaching with him when he became a coach in 1951. Again, it's interesting that in the war, despite the fact he became a PT instructor, he still suffered from racism. He was never posted abroad, unlike Trevor Foster and Ernest Ward. So he was always involved in based around here. He lived near York. He was stationed near York, and he was stationed near Dewsbury, and so he never went abroad. And I think one of the reasons for that will have been the fact that the army still was, shall we say, distrustful of the impact that having black soldiers in positions of authority, which he was a sergeant, and he was involved in, obviously involved in rehabilitating soldiers. The army was worried about that. It's also important to note that there was a colour bar in the army until October 1939. Black people in Britain could not join the armed forces until a month after the war broke out. And Roy actually joined before 2 weeks before the colour bar was lifted, because by that point the war had broken out. Lots of people were volunteering, and the army needed as many people as they could get. But so Roy still had to contend with that. After the war, it became clearer and clearer that he wanted to become a coach. And so he not only used his knowledge of rugby, the skills he'd gained as a PT instructor, he also saw himself as a mentor to his players, as a mentor to his players. So not only did he coach them in how to play rugby, how to stay fit, how to operate as a team, how to use modern training techniques, he also became a father figure. And you can see him here. He's in Hull, he's in a gents outfit, he's in Hull, and he's literally advising Tommy Harris, who's a smaller guy, and Johnny Whiteley about what clothes to wear. And I spoke to John, when I was writing the book, I spoke to Johnny Whiteley, who became a Hull captain, and himself became a great coach for Hull and Great Britain. And Johnny said, for most players, Roy became a father figure. That he would tell them, talk to them not only about rugby, but also talk to them about things like how to dress, how to eat well, what to do when you go to a restaurant, what cars to buy. He was a man of the world, and they looked up to him as a father figure. And you think, well, that's not unusual with coaches, that's not unusual with people in authority. But again, he's a black guy. He's a black person in 1950s Britain. How many other black people in Britain were in positions of authority in the 1950s? I suspect none. Literally. It's very, very difficult to find anybody in any position of authority over a group of white people. And probably true for most of the 1960s as well. So that tells you how extraordinary Roy was. The other thing that's very notable, and I spoke to players both at Leeds and Hull, who were coached by him, is that the teams that Roy created, there was never any hint of racism. And that wasn't just because people were frightened of Roy or because Roy was the boss. It just didn't exist. It never occurred to them that they would do or say anything that could be construed as racist. That was a philosophy that was also carried through by Roy's wife, Rena. Because the other thing that Roy did with his team, just to create a family atmosphere. He felt that it was important that families should be involved in the team and in the club. And his wife, Renee, who he'd married when he was 19 in Wigan, she came from Wigan. You can see her in the middle there, tall redhead. Renee was, if you like, the coach of the players' wives and girlfriends. And between them, they became almost these substitute parents. And so players and their wives would even go and see Roy and Renee if they had personal problems, if they had issues that they wanted advice on. Sorry. And that made his teams in Hull and at Leeds unique. Janet Seaborn, who was the wife of the Leeds, Roy's captain at Leeds, Barry Seaborn. Janet said that after Roy left Leeds in 1968, she never had a conversation with another rugby league coach apart from her husband Barry, when he coached Bradford as well in the 1970s. What Roy had achieved, what Roy and Renee together achieved, was absolutely unique. And probably, I would imagine, football as well, because the coaching systems are very, very similar. So, and again, it's an extraordinary story, because this was a mixed-race couple who had been together since the 1930s. It's interesting to know that Renee herself was very, would not tolerate any form of racism. When they first started going out together in Wigan in 1937, I think, Renee arranged it so that when they went to the pitches, they would arrive just as the lights were going down, in case they had any racist insults or people said anything was going in, and they'd leave just before the lights came on, which is a terrible thing to have to happen. But I think it demonstrates Renee's awareness of the impact that racism could have. Together, they had a policy of no toleration of racism. There's a story that Roy's two sons told me that when Roy moved to Leeds, they looked for a house, and Renee found one. Basically, Roy was obsessed with rugby, so Renee handled all the domestic stuff. Renee found a house in Seacroft in Leeds, and she went round, agreed the sale, and then went back the next week to measure up for curtains. You know, the usual thing you do. And when she got there, she was measuring up, and the woman who owned the house said, "Oh, are you related to Roy Francis, the new Leeds coach?" And Renee thought she must be a fan. Said, "Oh yeah, I'm his wife." And the woman said, "I'm sorry, we can't sell you the house then." And so Renee just got up and left without saying a word, because they had a zero tolerance of them. So their lives, Roy and Renee's lives, were shaped by the fact that for a lot of people during that time, race was seen as a problem. But within rugby, Roy could create a world where racism was not an issue. But that changed when he went to Australia to coach North Sydney. The club itself, despite the fact he had problems from the directors, problems from some of the players, he sought to create that family atmosphere again. And this is a picture of him. His first year as coach at North Sydney. He organised regular weekly barbecues for the players and their families. Roy and Renee was so keen to present a family atmosphere, they even volunteered to babysit for players and their wives during the week, which is kind of mind-boggling. I can't imagine any football manager or rugby coach today who says, "Oh yeah, if you fancy going out during the week, lads, just let us know, we'll come round and babysit for you." But that shows their level of commitment. But Australia at that time was a country that was a country that had a long history of racial discrimination. Roy went there in 1969. It was only in 1967 that Aboriginal Australians were counted in the census and allowed to vote in national elections. The £10 pond scheme, whereby you could emigrate, British people could emigrate to Australia for just £10, which lasted from the late 1940s all the way to the 1970s, was under the surface a whites-only policy. It was only changed in the 1970s. I'm sure many of you remember Charlie Williams, the comedian who was played for Doncaster Rovers at centre half for a long time. Charlie was signed by an Australian soccer club in the early 1960s, and when he applied for a visa to go there to play for him, he was turned down because of the colour of his skin. But Roy was lucky because after 1967, the country was getting more liberal in some ways. But what Roy found in Australia was that the press was incessant about its constant talk about the colour of his skin. And it got so bad that at one point he walked out of a live TV interview after the interviewer constantly asked him about what difference did it make as a black person, does the colour of his skin make any difference. He felt this was deliberately an attempt to put him on the back foot and not talk about his achievements, talk about just simply the fact he had a different colour skin to people. And eventually, he resigned, he got too much of it, and he resigned before the 1971 Rugby League season in Australia kicked off. And again, his sons told me that Reaney rang the sons up and said he's got to come back because he's on the verge of having a nervous breakdown. The pressure's just too much. So he came back to England. As I say, it didn't really work out, and he spent the next after he left North, he spent the next 12 years kind of in exile, and he became jaundiced with the game, the fact that he felt he'd not been recognised for the achievements that he'd made, and that he felt that he'd suffered from a legacy of colour prejudice. This is undoubtedly true, but I think, last slide, I think he kind of misunderstood what was going on, because by the time we get to the 1980s in Rugby League, it's beginning to change. 1982, the Australian Kangaroos came over and played a brilliant, exciting, attacking brand of Rugby League, which is exactly how Roy Francis trained his teams to be. All the backs could tackle like forwards, all the forwards could run and pass like backs. And in a sense, the type of Rugby League that's played at its best today is the legacy of Roy Francis. But there's also another aspect to this, I think, and that is the fact that Roy's experience growing up as a black child in South Wales, as a young man making his way in rugby in the north of England, taught him that what people need, what people desired, was respect. And that's what he gave to his teams, to his players. He based his coaching on giving them the self-confidence in their own abilities to play their best in his teams. He gave them self-respect, and he also demanded respect in return. And his teams were always built on that basis of mutual respect, which is probably the thing that he took from his life growing up as that black child, as that young black man. When racism deprives people of their respect, he understood how important that was to all people, of all races, of all colours. And that's what made Roy Francis so important and why he's still relevant today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tony. That's excellent, wonderful stuff, and really thought-provoking. Our next talk is on the 13th of December before the Reading game. It's me. I'm going to talk about... thank you. Thanks for that welcome. It's about German cricket in 1850s Bradford, which is probably a sentence you never expected to hear. And it's about the emergence of the teams of the wool warehouses in Little Germany, and how it was the first workplace cricket, and how that eventually moves on to the famous Bradford Cricket League. But
books are available.
oh yeah, sorry, commercial advert. Tony's books are available at a reasonable price, and he'll probably sign them for an unreasonable price. But once again, thanks again to Tony for coming along. It's been marvellous. Thank you, Tony.
So,